Hello, and welcome to this webinar by Pangeo Risk. My name is Robert Besseling. I'm the CEO at Pangeo Risk, and I'm joined today by three colleagues, our head of risk forecasting, Bilal Basuni, our head of Asia forecasting, Saif Islam, and our country risk analyst, Jack Brodsky. Now, the topic of our webinar today is the ongoing Gulf War and the impact on interconnected regions in Africa, Asia, and the wider Middle East region. As of 9 March, the Iran war is in its second week, following a major escalation that began on 28 February 2026. The conflict was initiated by a massive joint air offensive by the United States and Israel targeting Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure. The Pangeo Risk Country Risk Insight platform has covered this topic extensively, both in published special reports and on the platform's AI functionality. This webinar is an opportunity to look towards the next steps in the conflict and to see how other emerging markets will be affected. Bilal, this is probably a good moment to bring you in. You looked at this conflict for Pangeo Risk from the beginning and correctly forecast also about when the conflict was set to start. Now that the conflict is on the way, what is your baseline scenario for the conflict going forward? And how long will the conflict last? And will it spread further?
Yes, and I think these questions as well, Robert, we've covered quite extensively in our publications over the past few days. But our baseline scenario, and as we discuss in those publications, is a short, high-intensity confrontation that is likely to last between 1 to 3 weeks, which could then be followed by a slower tempering phase that can extend for another month or two. So, in essence, the fighting will remain concentrated in airstrikes, missile exchanges, and also maritime disruptions, rather than any large ground campaigns, which we haven't seen the signs for that as yet. Mainly because neither the United States, Israel, nor Iran currently show signs for preparing for major ground operations, and it's not in our baseline view that this will happen. So the conflict will continue to spread operationally across several fronts, and then also grow, particularly in Lebanon, Iraq, and possibly also stretch to the Red Sea over the coming days. So the longer the conflict goes on, the more we're likely to see it spread geographically in the region.
And when you say Red Sea, you mean Yemen and maybe Horn of Africa?
Precisely. I think Yemen here is the main actor through the Houthi alliance that has with Iran. So the longer the conflict continues, the more Iran's supporters will likely engage and
Understood. Thank you, Bilal. We are analysts, so we need to look at all scenarios. So what about less probable, but perhaps higher impact scenarios? How would these affect the Middle East?
So the most serious escalation would be sustained disruptions of Gulf energy infrastructure. And we've seen Iran target some of this energy infrastructure over the past few days. And we've saw processing hubs such as the ones in Ras Tanura in Saudi Arabia and Ras Laffan in Qatar remain offline for weeks. And we saw also Qatar announce force majeure and around some of its gas obligations. So this would push energy prices sharply higher and affect economies worldwide, and there is precedent for this. Another high impact scenario would be simultaneous escalation across those several fronts that we talked about. So if Hezbollah opens up a much larger front from Lebanon while attacks intensify in Iraq and those maritime disruptions expand in the Strait of Hormuz and Red Sea, this escalation control becomes far more difficult, and we may actually see at this stage a formal coalition being involved, including GCC countries, in reciprocal attacks with Iran. This would, of course, be a higher impact, worst case scenario.
It really would be, yes. I mean, so far we've seen 14 countries and territories directly involved in the conflict. But as we all know, this type of conflict has repercussions around the globe, particularly in Africa and Asia. Maybe this is the right time, Saif, to bring you in, from the Asian perspective. What are Asian governments and indeed companies in the private sector doing so far to mitigate the threat of protracted energy disruption? And as a follow-up, are some countries more or less resilient than others in Asia?
Hi, Robert. Well, Asian governments are broadly responding in three ways. Firstly, we are seeing immediate crisis response measures. For example, India has started rationing natural gas supplies to industrial users. Bangladesh and Myanmar imposed limits on fuel purchase. Pakistan is also preparing similar contingency plans. But secondly, there is a scramble to diversify supply. Again, India has started importing Russian crude after receiving a temporary waiver from the US. Indonesia is increasing crude imports from the US. Bangladesh has managed to secure some emergency fuel cargoes from Malaysia, which will last till the end of this month. So yes, they are trying to diversify supply. And last but not least, Asian governments are considering the use of their strategic reserves. And this is where resilience gaps are quite clear because Japan, for example, I mean, holds oil reserves covering about 250 days of imports. South Korea, more than 200 days. Uh, China also has massive reserves, but India's buffer is comparatively thinner. So countries with low reserves and tighter budgets, such as Pakistan or Sri Lanka, will obviously find themselves in a difficult position if the conflict drags on for some time. As you know, we published a special report on the conflict's impact on Asia last week, and we are publishing an updated one this week where we will delve into these issues in more detail.
Thank you, Saif. As you know, this is not just about oil and gas. Many of these regions are also highly interconnected. I mean, South Asia essentially accounts for the Middle East workforce. So maybe zoom in on this for a moment. So beyond energy supply risks, how exposed are South Asia's more fragile economies to the wider economic effects of the Iran conflict?
Absolutely. They are quite exposed. Multiple countries have high debt burdens or, heavy debt servicing obligations. They have limited foreign exchange reserves. And as you mentioned, there will be an impact on, remittances sent home from the Gulf. And these countries generally have very little fiscal room to absorb major shocks. That means a stronger dollar becomes a double problem as it raises the local currency cost of servicing external debt and also makes imports more expensive. Another issue is sectoral exposure. In Bangladesh, for example, where the economy is heavily reliant on ready-made garment exports, some of these exports in many containers have already been paused or they're stranded in Chittagong ports due to shipping disruptions in the Middle East. Sri Lanka and the Maldives are vulnerable because flight disruptions in the Middle East are impacting tourism flows. So the real challenge is that for these countries, this is not just an energy supply issue. It's also a balance of payments shock, a debt management shock, and in some cases, an export and tourism shock all at once.
Indeed. Thank you, Saif. Beyond Asia, I think, as usual, it is the African continent that is arguably the most vulnerable to these global economic shocks. Jack, do you agree with this? And from your analysis so far, how does the Gulf War impact Africa?
Thanks, Robert. So, of course, while African countries have limited exposure to the current theatre of war, there will, of course, be a considerable impact felt across the continent. And this impact will be felt acutely in the countries which import huge amounts of refined petroleum products from the Gulf. And this will be due to an absence of domestic refining capacity. By the numbers, South Africa is the largest importer of refined fuel on the continent, having overtaken Nigeria last year. And with the decline of production and refining production in major plants in Durban and Mossel Bay, President Cyril Ramaphosa acknowledged the pressing need, not only at the national level, but the continental level, to reduce import reliance. And this was during his speech at the Africa Energy Indaba last week. Kenya is another country that really springs to mind, having extended its agreements with Saudi Aramco, Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, and Emirates National Oil Company. Protracted disruption would be very damaging to Kenya. And the reality is that the longer the conflict stretches out and the more disruptions we see to shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, the more serious the consequences become. As Saif mentioned, higher costs are one thing, but material shortages, which throttle commercial activity and threaten a more broad-based economic slowdown, are another matter entirely. And these pressures are very pertinent, especially during a year where African countries face a huge external debt repayment wall, around about 90 billion US, which is a subject that we at Pangea Risk have been following closely for some time, and will publish another special report on this later in the month.
We certainly will, yes. That $90 billion debt wall certainly is impacted by the Middle Eastern conflict. But Jack, you and I know in any type of war scenario, there are always some winners as well. Some potential African countries walk away from this conflict with a benefit. Do any countries in Africa stand to gain from a conflict in the Middle East through their economic circumstances?
So rising prices of crude and liquefied natural gas will provide a boost to national export revenues in countries like Nigeria, Angola, and Gabon. But even in these fuel-rich countries, there will be winners and losers at the domestic level. If we take a look at Nigeria, the 2026 national budget benchmarked a price of crude at around $65 a barrel. So with prices now trading over $100, high export revenues will be a massive benefit. Another positive on that note would be the success of the Dangote refinery in the last months and years, which will reduce the impact of any potential fuel shortage. While the state-owned refineries at Port Harcourt, Warri, and Kaduna are now offline and officially defunct, the Dangote facility, which produces around 650,000 barrels a day, can mitigate any impact of the global supply crisis. But the impacts will be felt at the pump for the everyday consumer. The refinery, Dangote refinery, has already increased its premium motor spirit prices to nearly 1,000 naira per litre. And there will be a trickle-down effect in terms of transportation costs, as well as in goods and services. And really, this comes at a very difficult time for President Bola Tinubu, with potential higher inflation levels will be harder to take for the broader population in Nigeria. Careful management of this crisis, especially as we are just 1 year out from the 2027 general elections, will be a priority for the Tinubu administration.
Thank you very much, Jack. And actually, I wanted to ask the same questions to you, Jen, Saif, and Bilal. Maybe briefly, can you explain whether there are any countries in Asia first and then the Middle East that actually stand to gain from the outcome or the ongoing conflict in the Gulf?
Well, look, I mean, the conflict is broadly negative for Asia, and as Jack said, some producers may benefit, but then they may lose out in other ways. With that said, I would say the clearest beneficiary is Russia, because higher oil prices will certainly lift export earnings and fiscal revenues at a time when its war economy is under considerable strain. Asian buyers are obviously desperately looking for reliable non-Gulf energy suppliers. In Southeast Asia, hydrocarbon producers like Malaysia and Brunei also stand to benefit from higher prices. But at the same time, they are not immune to weaker regional trade or shipping disruptions and other complications arriving from the conflict. Last but not least, there may also be modest winners in financial services. Singapore and Hong Kong, for example, may attract new capital as some investors seek to move a portion of their assets from the Gulf to jurisdictions deemed safer right now.
Yeah, and I think for the Middle East, direct gains, and quite understandably so, will be limited given the geographic proximity to the conflict. But there are a few actors that could benefit strategically. Israel could benefit if Iranian missile infrastructure and regional networks are degraded, which could then weaken Iran's ability to project power through its allies, such as Hezbollah and other armed groups. And that would shift the regional military balance in Israel's favor in the longer term. And on the other hand, Turkey could gain diplomatically and economically. Turkey has positioned itself as a potential mediator in several regional crises. And if Gulf shipping remains disrupted, Turkey could also benefit from increased use of alternative energy routes and logistic corridors through its territory. But outside of those cases, most Middle Eastern states face higher risk than opportunity, and Gulf economies depend on stable energy export and secure shipping routes. So prolonged conflict in the Gulf generally damages regional stability rather than creates clear winners here.
Thank you, Bilal, and thank you, Saif and Jack, also for your contributions to this webinar. As this conflict continues in the coming weeks and beyond, our analysis and forecasting team at Pangea Risk will continue to cover the commercial impact of the war for our clients. Please log in to your Insight member account for more details, or reach out to your account manager for additional support on bespoke advisory requests. Finally, let me thank you very much for your support, and for those of you in the region, keep safe. Goodbye.